Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first of our four-part series, Art and Activism in Contemporary Global Landscapes. Please note that this session is being recorded. This series is hosted by the IAMCC, the Islamic Art and Material Culture Collaborative. The IAMCC is a research network based in Toronto that brings together the capacities of the University of Toronto, the Royal Ontario Museum, and the Aga Khan Museum. Our aim each year is to host an online workshop series, public lecture, and junior and senior fellows. To learn more about our upcoming programming, I would encourage you to go to our website, iamcc.ca, to see our events and also subscribe to our newsletter. I'm your host, Sanniah Jabeen. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto and Senior Fellow at the IAMCC. My co-host today is Michael Chagnon, the curator at the Aga Khan Museum. I would like to thank the IAMCC behind the scenes staff, which includes Nisa Rahman and Zaid Khan. Thank you for your hard work. Before introducing our speaker today, I would like to begin with our Canadian land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to the many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I appreciate the opportunity to welcome Abdullah Qureshi, a multidisciplinary artist, curator, and educator. Abdullah incorporates gestural, poetic, and hybrid methodologies to address autobiography, trauma, and sexuality through painting, filmmaking, and immersive events. His work has been exhibited internationally, and he has conducted lectures, paper readings, and artist talks around the world. In 2017, Qureshi received the Art and International Cooperation Fellowship at Zurich University of the Arts, and in 2018, a research fellowship at the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research in Boston. In 2019, he joined the Center for Feminist Research, York University, Toronto, as a visiting graduate student. Qureshi is currently a doctoral candidate at Aalto University, Espoo, and lecturer in fine art, contemporary practices at Northumbria University, Newcastle upon Tyne. That's a very illustrious list of accomplishments that Abdullah has, and so we're really excited to have him here today. And the title for our conversation today is Mythological Migrations, Imagining Queer Muslim Utopias, based off of Abdullah's doctoral project that examines formation of queer identity and resistance in Muslim migratory contexts. So this conversation will last for 1 hour, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I would like to start, first of all, thank you so much, Abdullah, for being here with us today.
For having me. It's a pleasure to be hosted.
So the first question is mostly kind of just related to who you are, and because so much of the work of contemporary artists focuses on questions of identity, and I see that your practice situates itself in the intersections of race, gender, and migration. Really relevant categories for the world today. Though it is difficult to disentangle these categories, I would like to begin by trying to understand how identity intersectionality influence your work.
Thank you for that. It's once again, it's a pleasure to be here and be in conversation with the both of you. So, I mean, as you said, thank you for the introduction as well, that I work as an artist, a curator, and also within education. And questions of identity have come into my work over the last decade and a half in so many different ways that it's difficult to kind of talk about a single definition, really. I mean, so I'll tell a personal story and hopefully that will make sense of this question. So I grew up in Pakistan. I lived there until I was 19 in Lahore. I traveled very little before that, and my exposures were literally home, like the family and friends from school. I went to art school in London at 19, and it was Chelsea College of Art, and that was the first time I left without my family. I was on my own, adulting as we call it now. or learning to really with financial support from my parents. And so it was really there that certain categories started to jump out, because prior to that, I'd never thought about what being Pakistani meant. I'd never thought about what being Muslim meant, because in Pakistan, the majority of people were Muslim. And sure, that kind of term has also complicated later on for me. But at that time, I thought, Muslimness existed in all its diversity, because I had members of my family who prayed and certain people didn't. I had women in my family some who covered and others who didn't. There were people who drank and others who didn't. So in that sense, Islam wasn't something that was taught to me and something that I was exposed to in a very strict sense. And there was this understanding that people can interpret it in their own way. And so it was really in London that, I was surrounded by very, European, other European students, that I kind of started to think, what are these terms for me? And of course, over the years, that kind of has become much, much more complex with, the kind of narrative around 9/11. What did it mean for a Pakistani artist to be in London at that time? Why was I painting the way that I was painting? If I was doing images that were abstract or kind of responding to gestural history of painting, was it inauthentic because it wasn't connected to the bulk of the work that was coming out of Pakistan, which at that time was focusing a lot on the post 9/11 narrative, where there was drones, there was violence, there was burqas as symbols that were being represented as art from Pakistan. And for me, that was really not my reality. And from what I knew in Lahore, that was not the reality of a lot of people in that city who were interested in art. And so over the years, as I've traveled, as I've moved back and forth between Pakistan and different places in the West, that question of identity and the positionality has become more complex for me, where I recognize that when I go to Pakistan, I also have a privilege. I have a dominant identity in the sense that I'm a cisgender male, I am Punjabi, I'm Sunni, and as we know, that kind of contradicts or kind of dominates over the Shia community, for instance, in Pakistan, or the fact that men kind of occupy space from women, and it can be and often is a very patriarchal society. And so all of these kind of factors, and then what happens when it further complicates, where I go to Finland as a doctoral candidate, and so even though I am working as a racialized individual in a predominantly white context, as someone who now is coming to Finland after years of education, of professional experience, of knowing how to navigate a space, I can hold privilege there, let's say, in comparison to the refugees and asylum seekers that were coming in, right? So those two narratives are not the same, right? I cannot necessarily I didn't want to kind of take the position of representing their stories and identifying with them just because we may share certain backgrounds from a region that was the same. And so for me, really, the question of identity, there's no answer to what identity and race and all these intersections mean, but I'm really invested in that as a lifelong process because of my own experiences and how it reveals. I mean, the fact that we come to Canada, I think the land acknowledgement is such a beautiful way of learning as an immigrant when we're coming into this land that is settler colonial state, right? And how we as immigrants are propagated this idea of Canada as a queer person coming to Canada at that time. I thought, oh, this will be freedom for me. I'm escaping the kind of restrictions that are imposed upon me in Pakistan, and I come to Canada and I can live my gay queer life with all its freedoms, right? And then, of course, you come and kind of are then complicit in the violence of the colonizing state, right? And so these kind of positions are constantly in flux. And I think that for me, personally, I'm interested in recognizing that and growing with that and having that feed into all the work that I do, whether it's about art making or curating or teaching.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. And I kind of, I growing up in Pakistan myself, I completely understand, because you never kind of question what you are until you're confronted with difference. And I think in a place like Pakistan, difference is kind of suppressed as compared to celebrated, and in most part of the world as well. But so I'm kind of interested in kind of hearing you talk a bit more about that. What is your experience and understanding of being Muslim, especially when we consider Islam as a practice that is not monolithic, but has many shades of interpretation and practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, again, kind of it connects a bit with my personal story. I think when I moved to London, I was really, that was the first time I started questioning sexuality. And at the same time, I was also grappling with a long history of trauma that was rooted in sexual abuse and violence. And for me, it was difficult to kind of separate the two at that time as someone who was 19, but also as someone who had grown up in Pakistan, despite liberal exposures to Islam, at that time, I felt that somehow I was choosing a life or going into a life of sin. And so in that particular moment, it felt that I had to choose between being a Muslim and, aspects of my desire that I was beginning to recognize. And so, well, it's something that took years of living and also doing healing work to kind of come to terms with it, but also meeting a lot of people, other people who were talking about Islam in different contexts, or religion in general, talking about sexuality and gender. And so these conversations ultimately started to make sense for me in 2016, I want to say. I attended the Muslim Jewish conference, and basically it's a very interesting context where you have 50 Muslims from all over the world and 50 Jewish people come together to kind of engage in different conversations. And over there, it was just very interesting that that year there was a visibly LGBTQ contingent present. And when the conversation on sexuality began, it was just so interesting to see the heterosexual community, predominantly of the Jewish and Muslim faith in that conference, went to one side, telling all the others on what is right and wrong and what is prescribed and not. And all these people who were LGBTQ were on this one side, kind of just confused, but together as Jewish and Muslim people. And I think it was a very interesting experience for me. And the following day, when the conversation happened, just to kind of mediate the kind of tension that had happened, one of the moderators spoke about how Judaism evolved in the modern context as a religion that is not just about theology. It is also about culture. It is also about community. Sometimes, they talk about it as race now. And so in that sense, any religion is that, right? What makes us think that Islam doesn't have cultural aspects? How we celebrate Eid in Pakistan is very different to how Eid is going to be celebrated in North Africa, because the culture and the kind of history of that space informs it. So wherever, Islam has traveled and exists, it will be a pluralistic space. It is also community. For me, when I meet someone Muslim, I can still share something despite, even if they are homophobic, even if they don't agree with my sexuality. It's not something that automatically shuts me off from talking to them about certain things that we still can meet on, right? And so I think that for me, when that started happening, it liberated. It certainly liberated what religion could be, what spirituality could be, and how my identity has to fit within that. Beyond that, if we look at it in a more kind of researched format, I think I found the work of Amna Wadud, who who is a female Islamic scholar, and she has written a lot on Islamic theology and talks a lot about how to approach the place of women in Islam. And I feel like queerness really in Islam finds its way to in terms of how we approach women and feminism in Islam. And I'm using feminism as a term broadly. So someone like Amna Wadud would not use the term feminist because it is not a term that existed then. Still, I think it is, for me, I think those kind of approaches have been really liberatory because it allows you to have this individual relationship with the sacred text. It allows you to access it. And it also reveals how translation, the act of translation is not, is almost always a subjective act, that the person translating it will always influence that. And that can be extended to, of course, governments and empires that also had agendas where all of these things have happened. And so in that sense, for me, that has been a liberatory experience where I have certainly been able to think about religion and Muslimness in an expansive sense. I don't feel the need, as long as it internally feels all right to me, that I am on the right path. I'm living a life of honesty. It's sufficient for me. And in terms of my work, it extends, as we will talk about it later as well, where I am looking at traditions that are rooted in Islamic art and architecture and extending them now, right? So for me, I think it is just that. So I certainly do not like to propagate that this is the only way to be Muslim or queer. You know, 5 queer Muslims can be in the room and we can all kind of have a different perspective on it, and that's totally fine and fair, you know. But no one has the right to strip me of my Muslimness without my consent, because I have chosen that path when I was born into it, and then I voluntarily chose it based on my understanding. Nobody has the right to kind of take that away from me, except for God.
You've touched on a really, I'm going to jump in. You've touched on this really interesting point, because starting with this conversation about intersectional identity, and now and Sanniah's question just now about Muslimness, it just illustrates the point that, you know, disentangling the way you see Islam and the way you see your queer identity is probably an impossible task, I would venture to say. And I wanted to just ask, as we go on into the conversation, and we're thinking about queer identity. You've mentioned that you have a very particular definition that you work with when you're thinking about queerness. And so I think it's important for us to understand that definition that you work with, and how it sort of has impact on your work, and maybe touch back on this question of intersectional identity as well.
How about I show a trailer first of one of the films, and then maybe the audience that is listening, it can kind of help them also visualize some of the ideas that I'm talking about. So I'll go here. If people can't hear this, please let us know.
ਚਾਹੇ ਪੁੱਛੋ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਂਡੀਆਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਅੰਦਰ ਬਲਦੀਆਂ ਡਾਂਡੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਅਰਜ਼ ਨਾ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਚੰਗੀ ਬੋਲਦਾ ਪਰ ਕੁਝ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ਾਂ ਤੇ ਅਟਕਦਾ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਉਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਪਾਰ ਪਰਦੇਸ ਦਾ ਵਾਂਡੀ
So Yeah, so I think that for me, as I mentioned earlier, that, there was a lot of discomfort at 19 particularly, of making sense of my sexuality and faith. And that's, predominantly but there was also discomfort with sexuality on its own. So for example, I very much remember, like, friends of mine taking me to a gay club in London, and I did not fit in there. I saw this kind of sea of white men who were very muscular, and I felt uncomfortable. I felt even more exposed. I felt more aware of my brownness and body hair, and felt undesirable in a way that I'd never felt before, right? And of course, at that time, I did not have the kind of criticality that I do now. And so I kept going back, trying to assimilate, but not really fitting in, fetishizing myself, or, kind of trying to kind of fit into that culture. And so eventually, when I went back to Pakistan, I was there. I started kind of meeting different people who were struggling in similar ways to me. But then also, when I started becoming more confident and more engaged in professional work, I started interacting with non-government organizations and activists that were working on gender and sexuality in Pakistan. And I remember a moment very particularly where, there was this night, and on that night, we were just there at this gathering, and it was about some policy that was being discussed on transgender issues. But in that room at that time, there were gay men, there were lesbians, there were people who were trans men, trans women, Khwaja Sara, and the entire spectrum, of the community in Lahore, who were fighting together for something, for a change, and which later kind of built its momentum into what's known as the Transgender Act in Pakistan, right? And I think for me, that was queerness, right? That was that for the first time I felt I belonged. For me, I don't think that I felt entirely safe, or I've never found myself in an entire room of men. I don't feel comfortable there with my own history. So why would I do that? Just because now I desire, those men don't automatically make me feel safe. And so queerness then became this expansive idea on a personal level. In terms of work, I think that as I started to look at queer theory, as I started to read about queer theory, as Jaspir Puar has pointed out, and many others, it started to become apparent with my own experience that queer theory and method as we know it is very Western dominated. And while in Pakistan, I was also becoming aware of how importing that idea or imposing those ideas can not only be detrimental, but also dangerous. Because of, for example, what happened at the US Embassy about a decade ago, where some law was passed in the US, and the ambassador there at the time decided to have a party in the embassy and release a press statement committing support for the LGBT community in Pakistan, and no one asked, right? And so at that time, there was a lot of work that was being done by LGBTQ activists in the country. But reflecting on that moment, a lot of people have said that it pushed back our struggle by decades, because nobody before that was talking about LGBTQ issues in Pakistan. They were letting us do our work, but by that press statement, I associated this cause as a US-led cause, one that was being funded by the US, which it wasn't, And so people didn't never use the word gay over there, and it was plastered all over marketplaces that people used to go to with statements that they were unwelcome there, and all of this stuff, that kind of happened. And so for me, then it has been important to kind of navigate this duality where certainly I move and exist and converse in the West, but I also go back home and in Pakistan, and I have community there. I have people there who live there, and why would I want to kind of work in a way that is for another gaze? It is for another eye that I might not be interested in responding to. Why can there not be pluralism and alternative formats of queerness? It's as if queerness was invented in the West when it has existed throughout time. And we have evidence of that within Islamic history. We have evidence of that in so many other histories that the colonizers eradicated, right? And so for me, then it is again an ongoing process of entangling, if we like, of finding and discovering those histories that have existed, and not bring in queer theory to impose that onto these spaces, quote unquote, elsewhere, but to use histories of the elsewhere to expand what queer theory can be in the West.
You know, when you talk about kind of not just your move from in between kind of living in the West, working in the West, and then coming to Pakistan and feeling at home, that kind of also feels like a queer act to me, existing in the middle of two spaces, never completely feeling as if you belong in either of them. But I'm interested more in kind of the trailer that you showed. Like I from earlier conversations, I know that it's a part of your doctoral project, and I'm kind of interested in hearing you talk more about it. And we've also talked about that, you know, that your doctoral research focuses on excavating history. And I think you would need to talk more about what you're working on currently, which is really exciting work, and maybe share that with our audience. And I can also share images on the site so that people get a sense of what is it that you are trying to accomplish.
Sure. I think that I mean, as you kind of asked that question for the first time, I thought I probably used the term history liberally. I don't think that I approach history as a historian. I think, so, I mean, because I'm an artist, and I guess being an artist gives me that license to kind of play around and to work with untraditional formats of approaching research, let's say. I think that I've been really interested in oral traditions of storytelling. Growing up, I think they were always there. And I remember I used to have, you know, he was a driver for my family, Hanif uncle. And, you know, him and I, when he used to pick me up from school, he used to kind of just tell me stories, all kinds of stories from the Mughal period to kind of like, you know, of Sufi saints and legends. So that's really where, you know, at an early age, at a formative age, I was kind of hearing these stories from a driver about radical acts in Islam, right? Islamic history. And so with my doctoral research, and as I started kind of going back to queerness, I was reminded of those stories and I started thinking about them. Of course, we, you know, in the West predominantly they discuss Rumi and Shams a lot. But in Lahore, we have Madhu Lal Hussain. So Madhu Lal was a Hindu boy, and Shah Hussain is the Sufi saint. They're known as one together. They're buried together. Annually, their death anniversary is celebrated as Mela Charaga in Lahore, where people go and dance and, you know, engage in spiritual practice. To me, it became irrelevant at that point, you know, to kind of prove any kind of sexual relationship between the two. For me, I think that, you know, what is incredibly important in those kind of traditions, what I refer to one aspect of history in my work, is that it was a radical act that they chose to kind of live as intimate companions, as friends together, that they're buried together. And throughout time, there is this tradition now of like that memorializes their togetherness, right? And so for me, that becomes one of the examples that I look at. I'm also very inspired by the story of Rabia al-Basra. And when you read her story, I mean, I think, you know, it is evident that she was someone who was very disciplined in her approach. But as a woman at a very early period in Islamic history, she asserts a position of agency, and she refuses marriage, and her position to pursue divine love. She is the founder of the concept of divine love. Often most people accredited it to Rumi, but Rabi al-Basra was the one who came up with it for the first time. Her pursuit of divine love is regarded so highly that her story tells the legend that the Kaaba moved to meet her halfway because it was so excited that she was making her way there. And so I think that there are all of these stories that are obviously legends in Sufism, but they really interest me. You know, they really interest me because they speak about a resistance that is not current in Islamic history, but it has existed for a long time, that has reacted to, that has emerged from the margins, that has reacted to state or empirical approaches to religion, to have these kind of structured approaches and singular approaches to religion. It has constantly been in reaction with that. And of course, we know that throughout time, Sufi saints of that sort have been persecuted as well. But perhaps that's, for me, that is a queer history in terms of its politicalness, how it refuses to exist in the now, as Jose Esteban Munoz would say. It kind of opens up the potentiality of what divine love, what companionship, what spirituality, what prayer can be. You know, all of these aspects become so expansive in that philosophy. And that is Islamic history. You know, and then, you know, there are other artistically and visually, I work with Charbagh, as you saw in this trailer, and then the figure of the Burak. The Charbagh, as some might know, is mentioned in the Quran as 4 gardens in heaven. And we know that throughout the Ottoman, in the Persian and the Mughal periods, at the very least, we see manifestations of the Charbagh in architecture. The Taj Mahal has it, the Naqsh Jahan Square in Isfahan has it, you know, Shalimar Gardens in Lahore has it, so many places in India have it, and so much so that it features in painting. So not only we have this tradition in Islam of taking the sacred work and translating it into physical architecture in this embodiment, but something that was constantly being, you know, reinvented in these different phases of Islamic history. So why should we stop that process of interpretation now? And why should we, after colonial ruptures, not be allowed to pursue innovation within that?
I think that brings us to a question that you and I had talked about right before we jumped in to the session. So it's a bit of an impromptu thought that we were having, but this idea of pursuing these ruptures and pursuing the ability to return to things that we think are set in stone, so to speak, and that goes for history and that goes for artwork. So generally in contemporary art practice, we see experimentation with media, and we see the ability to use new media. In your case, you were trained in painting and you've moved into performance and video. So really that shift into a time-based media and kind of impermanent media, editable media, I think it's really interesting that there's something about the medium of performance and video and film that is germane to understanding some of the issues that we're talking about. So maybe if you want to talk to us a bit about what was it that drew you specifically to film and performance as appropriate, as the best way of expressing some of these ideas that we were talking about.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that I mean, so when I started this research project in 2017, Mythological Migrations, I was very clear from the beginning that I did not want to use painting as a strategy of artistic research. It might inform my process, but I was hesitant to bring it in because I felt that, when I'm talking about queerness, migration, Islam, I don't want to make my painting illustrating that, and so I don't know. And to be honest, I don't know how I would be able to do that justice, really, to talk about an expansive issue through painting that, for me, emerges from such a personal and autobiographical space. It will almost always be my perspective. But I think working in performance-based ways, film, and even immersive events, live events, where the films, kind of become installations that are stages, really, and incubators for other queer Muslim people to come in, was really to kind of talk about how this is not a singular conversation, but a collective one. And because it is a conversation in flux and in that is evolving as we're all growing, it means that, there's a temporality, that is there, that kind of lends itself very well. There is, of course, agency in performance. I think the body will always be political. And, if you look at refugees and asylum seekers that were coming into Europe at that time, and the narrative that was being projected about them, and how some of them who were gay and queer men were being denied entry into nightclubs in Finland, in Helsinki, particularly gay clubs, because they were reading this Muslim man who, as a Muslim man first, and that as after 9/11 as a terrorist figure in media and visual culture and in so many places, trumped his potential gay or queerness, right? And so they were denying them access to the nightclubs. And so for me, I think then, you occupy a nightclub, you organize a band that is singing Palestinian or Arab music, a Palestinian queer woman is singing all this Arab music in a nightclub, and you have this visible community that is resisting and standing together. There is power and in that assembly as well, in those bodies, in that performance, that act of performance and protest. It becomes quite radical. And for me, I was interested in creating those moments in the work, right? And so all of these things happen, and I think it also opens up a lot of interesting, as in artistic research, they call it the serendipitous moment, where the sound technician of the nightclub, where I did my first artistic component, chapter 1, the nightclub, was trying to adjust the sound equipment with one of the musicians who was using an oud. And the person who played the oud did not speak too much English or Finnish, and the other one obviously did not speak Arabic. And you were just seeing these frustrated gestures between them because the depth of the oud exceeded the limit of the sound system in that nightclub, right? And so I think it was incredibly powerful to witness moments like that. And the sound technician was lovely. He was really trying to make it work, but it was a history that was much more layered and nuanced than.
There's a metaphor in that, obviously, about containment, about translation, about all sorts of issues. Yeah.
And precisely, and that is where, I noted that, the trailer didn't have the translation, and it reminded me of a conversation because there's Punjabi poetry being read at the beginning of that film, and the translation in English was done by the same poet, and he essentially rewrote the poem in translation. It's not a literal translation. And oftentimes when, I screen this film and there's a Punjabi in the room, and they become very offended that, it's not being translated accurately. And then I'm like, well, can it ever be translated accurately? and why are we trying to translate? Perhaps we should accept that, there are these differences, and why not celebrate them, And so in that sense, that's, how my queer framework and my kind of excavation of history has emerged, where it kind of takes these ideas and kind of works with them and applies them, and just kind of presents different views within that.
I'm going to just riff off that for a second, because I've been thinking quite a bit about working on a project that considers translation, mistranslation, interpretation, how it works or doesn't work. And I think going back to this idea of using your, creating visual art, creating performance, creating these spaces, and the importance of the imminent act of performance, of filmmaking, how that is meant to be something that provides an immediate experience that goes beyond translation. So the idea that, this is leading up to another question I have, but I'm just wondering about that idea of translatability and where you feel you as the human that you are, the artist that you are, and the ideas that you want to express. Do you think that there is the possibility of translation and for your audience?
I mean, I don't know if I ever think concretely about translation. When I'm writing differently, and I'm trying to kind of explain myself differently. If I'm making a film, I'm doing other things. As an artist, I've always known this, and this is true for painting or films or events that I create, that I have always been open to someone else arriving at the work and interpreting it. I've never been one to be too precious about the artist's intent. So if someone comes and tells me that this painting looks like that to them, I would welcome that, and so for me, sometimes that opens up ways of seeing that I may be closed to. So, I think that for me, like as an artist, in terms of my method, it's a very collaborative and dialogical one with medium, where I am interested in, where I approach film and performance very much the same as painting, where I go and I'm not interested in revealing too much the artist's mark. I am interested in the paint collaborating with me, moving in the way that it does. In film, it did present challenges because oftentimes in Pakistan, there isn't a tradition too much of artist films. And so you have, it's growing now, but at that time there was nothing. And so people that you're working with often come from traditional film and TV backgrounds. And so they're used to a script. They're used to directors shouting at them and directors telling them exactly what they want. And I'm standing there, I'm like, well, now I've created this mise en scène. What would you do here as you? And they're like, well, what do you want us to do? And I'm like, do whatever you would do. And so I think over time, that kind of technique has become much more kind of advanced, where I create situation and prompts in terms of allowing the unexpected to happen. And that's really what I'm interested in. I get to know the performers that I'm working with. I often, I pick them either through Instagram or community, and I've worked with them over several periods. And so there's a relationship, and that allows me to develop these kind of characters that fit those people as well, and allow for the unexpected to manifest, right? So I'm really interested in that kind of artistic process, and that certainly extends when the work is exhibited as well, where the events that I'm creating will never be structured in a way. I guess this was going, where Sanniah and we were preparing this, and, Sanniah was worried if the images come out at the wrong time. And I'm like, that will be totally fine if that happens, right? So I'm always looking for those moments, because I feel like the image appearing or a situation happening at a different time opens up a different way of talking about it. And that's totally fine.
I love that we've been sort of hugging all of these issues related essentially to fluidity to some extent, to this very, a less structured approach, and that's a less structured approach to history, a less structured approach to creation, collaboration, and also just thinking about identity as well. And I think that in thinking about contemporary art, particularly in Canada, and how much identity is central to Canadian contemporary art, or the contemporary art scene in Canada, group exhibitions and so forth. I'm wondering about the sort of the complexity of identity that you explore autobiographically. Have you ever felt boxed in by your having showing your work, or approaches to your work, working with other curators and so forth? How do you feel that you and your work are represented in some of these contexts?
Two directions to this, I think, and perhaps the short answer is yes. I think that because, as I said, I went to art school in London. Actually, at school, I never felt restricted. I didn't feel that art tutors in London made me think too rigidly about being Pakistani or Muslim. They encouraged my investigations into boundaries of painting at that time, as I was thinking. It's after I graduated how I struggled to kind of find a place in contemporary painting. And my peers, who graduated with me, who were European and white, were very quickly contextualized into contemporary painting and contemporary sculptures. And for me, that kind of recognition started to come when I naturally started talking about queerness, Islam, and migration, because those were topics that were kind of connecting, right? So I'm very cognizant of that and disrupting that conversation, and always push for formal aspects of the work, because this is, and kind of resist as much as we can of, queer Muslim artists to an exhibition, because at the end of the day, the work has complexity as well. But coming back to the box and thinking about the box or the rectangle, if we like, why does it have to be rigid? I think that where I come from, certainly like South Asia, if you look at a Mughal painting, it's a very small frame, which is a box, and it can have many boxes within it. But in that small frame, you have sometimes the emperor sitting with his advisors, and then the entire palace behind him, where his wives and servants are hanging out. And then outside you see a bazaar and people doing trade, import and export. And you have armies fighting far away, and all the lands that he owns, and also angels on the top guarding this. So you have the celestial and terrestrial in a very small box. And that is how complex our histories are. That is how complex as beings we are. And I think it is continued colonial violence that expects us to be linear or singular in our approach, that attempts to reduce our complexity, right? So in my work, when I started this research project, everyone, kept saying, focus, focus, focus. I'm like, no, because I know it will come together. It always does, because that is the kind of, history that I've absorbed because of where I grew up, right? And so that's really what I advocate for. So boxes in themselves don't scare me, but I think that, if someone tries to forcibly box me, that's something that I do not take quite easily.
Thank you. This was fascinating, just hearing you talk about it, and and it kind of gives me encouragement as a PhD candidate, like just to let things just kind of go, and sometimes letting go of structure is the best way to achieve structure that you were looking for. We are nearing our 1 hour mark, so I would encourage our participants to put forward any questions that they have for Abdullah. And Michael, if you have any more thoughts, please feel free to jump in.
No, I think this was just it's been such a great experience getting to know Abdullah. Thank you so much for sharing yourself. Thank you for sharing your work with us today and your thoughts. It's encouraging to see artists working in ways that really go beyond just the surface question of what is identity and checking a box and all of that, and moving into these really complex issues. And today, you're sharing all of that with us today is, I think, very, very important, and is very illuminating for this series as we think about contemporary art practices and resistance in this series.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that our audience perhaps has been fulfilled through all of your answers and all of our discussion. And I certainly do feel very kind of fulfilled, kind of emotionally, spiritually, academically through this conversation. But and so the audience is asking where they can view more of their work, or more of your work. I think we've shared your website in our promotions, but we will share that with you again once we send out a follow-up email.
Yeah, I mean, if people want, if there's a researcher or someone interested in looking at a certain film, they can always write to you, Sanniah, and you can forward that query to me, and I'm happy to share a link of a film or something like that. Sometimes they're playing, sometimes they're not, like in different places, but always happy to, share the work with other artists and researchers. So just ask them to email you and you can forward it to me.
Okay, thank you. And Abdullah, is your film complete? The word complete is kind of it is kind of loaded, but I'm wondering, like, is it still a work in progress, or do you?
I mean, in terms of unstructured, I think this might give you and maybe your PhD's committee, like, kind of like a horrifying thought. But when I started my PhD, that was the first time I went into filmmaking, and I made these two films that were going to be part of these two artistic components that form my dissertation along with a monograph. And then after the second component, I was just so exhausted, and like I just felt like I cannot think about this anymore, that I ended up signing up for another educational degree and started an MFA in film, because I felt that, I need to take a break from my PhD to do a master's. But really, I was really interested in, at that time, gaining a lot more confidence about film production. And I was interested in learning a lot more about that language. And so then I made a film at the end of that. And so unintentionally, these films, Journey to the Charbagh, Cruising Other Ways of Love, which were part of my artistic components in Helsinki, are extended in Mela Jalus. And so now I look at those three films and I'm like, okay, well, it would be nice to go back to them and maybe make one film out of them, right? Because they're done over 3 years. And so there is that process of reflection. And I think research, I mean, we do this in writing. When we write something, we're constantly, kind of editing it. There is a process of editing, and we can share snippets of that writing as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't kind of re-access it and rework it either. And so that is the same with artistic practice as well, in my opinion. I don't think that as long as the work is accessible to me in the studio, it will probably never be finished, and I may reapproach it at any time. So that danger will be there. But I think, so this film project, I think I do want to kind of make one film out of the 3 films and see how that functions. And then maybe once I'm done with the PhD, I'll move on to other spaces, hopefully.
Whenever you're done with, as much as you can be done with it, like, we would let us know. We would love to do a screening here in Toronto and kind of hear the conversations that come out from it. So for those of you asking, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel, which will be shared in a newsletter. And I think that we have one more question that I appreciated your comments on the potentials of the box, but also resisting the box. How can it both be a cosmology, but it can also be a limiting construct to impose a prescribed view? Can you share how you creatively navigate the imposed box, or even how the box can be an opportunity?
Yeah, for sure. I think that over time, this might be a question that students, and especially PhD students, get asked a lot, is who is your audience? Know your audience, right? And I think over time, as I've navigated between Pakistan and met queer communities that exist and function, whether in the diaspora or in spaces back in their home outside the West, it has become very clear to me that I'm less and less interested in seeking the validation of Western institutions, if you like, right? Of course, one is part of it, but I like to be part of it in a way where I have agency to ask and challenge those spaces rather than be someone who is just fulfilling their quota of diversity, right? And I don't want to be in that space. And so for me, I'm not interested in that, anymore. I used to be, we all are. I mean, that is the result of colonial residue. I mean, I don't know if we all are, but I mean, I remember a point where I thought that I would want to be validated by these Western institutions in terms of my art production. And so how those boxes that the West imposes upon me become less important then, because I can constantly change them based on how I'm changing. But what I do not compromise on is to set mentors and community members back for me in Pakistan who I respect, who are queer, who are living there, whether they are 19 and 20 themselves or, older. I'm talking to a range of them constantly, and I allow them to kind of give me generous feedback, critical feedback. I'm not afraid to kind of be questioned in a way that I grow, right? And it's okay that two generations may see things differently as well, but I always remain open to that process of critical dialogue and reflection. And that helps me kind of navigate these boxes better, because ultimately, I think for me, working and presenting in the West, one of the biggest concerns was how I do not feed into self-orientalization. How do I not kind of further these narratives that project, let's say, spaces like Pakistan as exclusively violent and restrictive spaces for queerness, right? And then, and then come here and become that kind of agent who kind of was liberated from that space, given freedom in Canada or wherever. And I can be this is one of the questions that came very early on in my research when I was showing an exhibition of queer paintings from Pakistan that I'd done. And the people asked, oh, can you show this in Pakistan? I'm like, well, this is in Pakistan. Like, I don't know if you've been following that conversation or not. Or, recently, it was earlier last year in Berlin, I showed my film Mela Julus. And at the end of the conversation, because they were hearing me speak as someone who was so comfortable with my sexuality and kind of talking about art and expression and all of that. This person asked me very genuinely, do you go back home now? And I'm like, this film was made entirely in home. I don't think at that moment, I don't think I understood the full complexity of that question, because at that time I responded like, yes, of course, I go home. I was home right now. Like, because it was like an exhibition opening, but it was later in reflection that I realized that perhaps they were surprised because I was so open. They thought that I cannot go there. And, somehow I am restricted from that space. And so I think for me, that's how I navigate boxes, because I think I am trying to kind of escape those boxes on a personal level constantly, that then it kind of translates into practice as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that insightful kind of response. If there are no more questions, I would like to I think we can end this session. But thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to our audience for remaining engaged throughout. I hope to see you all at our next event on Saturday, the 18th of March at 11 a.m. EST, where we engage with Canadian Guyanese artist Kashif Ghani, who expresses his experiences through ceramic. This is the first of our 4-part series, and we would love to see you come again and again and bring others who might be interested as well. But again, my sincere gratitude towards you, Abdullah, for taking the time, and to our audience as well for sticking with us on a Saturday morning when there could be other things that you have to do. But thank you so much. And in case of any questions, feedback, please reach out to us on our website and on our social media. And you will be sent a recording of this if you signed up for this, and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.
For all your organizations, Sanniah and the IAMCC. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with both of you.
Thank you. Great. Bye.